All right. It is my deep honor today to welcome you to our last for the year Distinguished Visiting Lectures. It is still being done remotely, so I can't literally welcome you to Robson Hall, which is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. But even so, we are enormously excited to welcome Dr. Teresa Scassa virtually to Robson today to talk about a very important topic, the Surveillant University. Dr. Scassa has her law degrees from McGill, LB, and BCL, an LLM from the University of Michigan, a doctorate from the University of Toronto. She has taught law at the University of Ottawa for many years, where she is the Canada Research Chair in Information Law and Policy. So she's going to give us a lecture today, which will be recorded, just so everyone knows. My colleague, Professor Katie Zalagi, will then take over for the Q&A, where we will turn off the recording so everyone can be as honest as possible before I will briefly wrap up. So with that, I will happily turn it over to Dr. Scassa.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this distinguished visiting speaker series. It's a real pleasure to be virtually at Robson Hall. It's unfortunate it couldn't have been in person, but hopefully there will be better times ahead. So what I'll do to start off, I'll just put my slides up on the screen. It should just take a second. Okay, there we go. So yeah, my talk today is titled The Surveillant University, Remote Proctoring, AI, and Human Rights. It's a project that was motivated in part by the pandemic, obviously, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the relationship of the pandemic to this topic, but it's also builds on my research and interest in the governance of artificial intelligence. So the pandemic does play a role in this story. In March of 2020, the WHO, as I'm sure you all recall, the WHO declared a global COVID-19 pandemic, and universities around the world started shifting their courses to online learning. And so you can imagine, you were part of it, right? That this is a pretty dramatic event to happen in the middle of a university semester with exams just around the corner, something that nobody's been planning for online learning, and so the courses have all been designed for in-person exams proctored in the usual manner, and so there's this massive shift to online. An EDUCAUSE survey that was carried out in April of 2020 and that looked at schools in the US and Canada found that 70% of the universities that responded to the survey indicated that they had already subscribed or were planning to use online proctoring services as part of their pandemic response. So that's quite a significant uptake of these services in response to the pandemic. There are a whole range of private sector companies that offer online proctoring services, and that existed prior to the pandemic, because this is something that existed and in fact was doing quite well prior to the pandemic. I put some of them on the screen. Respondus was the one that the University of Ottawa adopted. It was also the one adopted by the University of Manitoba, but there were others that were adopted in Canada, United States, and around the world, in fact. And I think that although I started off by framing this in terms of the pandemic, it's important to remember that remote proctoring predates the pandemic, and it's also going to continue to be used after the pandemic. It may also be used more often by universities after the pandemic, simply because the pandemic, I think, has stimulated an interest on the part of universities in having more remote learning or distance learning options available to students. And the other thing to note, of course, is it's not just used in university context, but it is used in for career training programs, for professional certifications, including bar exams, and in a whole range of different contexts. And of course, it's used in high schools as well. Part of the pandemic story is also a story of resistance to remote proctoring. And there were pockets of resistance to forms of remote proctoring prior to the pandemic, but they didn't get a lot of traction. The massive or the significant uptake of remote proctoring during the pandemic brought the issues that it raises to the fore. And I think this is also the period in which we see more forms of remote proctoring that rely on artificial intelligence. And I think that's part of the pushback as well. And so we see during this period some significant resistance that manifested themselves in a range of different ways. So for example, students at the University of Amsterdam in 2020 attempted to obtain an injunction to prevent their university from using remote proctoring. And that injunction was ultimately unsuccessful. They didn't obtain the injunction. There were the civil society organization EPIC in the United States filed a complaint with the Attorney General of the District of Columbia. That's still ongoing. A number of US senators sent an inquiry letter to the 3 top remote proctoring companies in the US, asking them to provide more information about their services. There were some universities that, not just universities, I should say, some incidents of refusals to participate. And so, for example, the faculty of law, my faculty of law at the University of Ottawa decided not to, even though the university had signed a contract with Respondus, had decided that those services would not be used for any law school exams. Many professors responded by changing their evaluation methods, and that was fairly widespread. There was a lot of attempts to avoid remote proctoring by avoiding the kind of exams that would require it. There were many student petitions against remote proctoring. You can find those on change.org. Many of them were hosted on change.org. And of course, there were many news and social media reports of problems with remote proctoring. So there was a lot of resistance and a lot of negative publicity about remote proctoring services. When I, looking at the materials relating to this, I think there's so many different ways in which you could frame this narrative. In other words, there's so many different ways in which you could approach and write a paper about remote proctoring and AI. It could certainly be a paper that looks at how the pandemic accelerated the uptake of technology solutions and how it normalized certain forms of invasive technologies. You could use it as a case study for AI remote monitoring technology. There's remote monitoring technology that's being deployed in workplaces, in universities and schools and so on. And so it's an interesting case study of that type of technology. And you could also use it as a case study of the complexity of mounting legal challenges to the adoption and use of these types of technologies, because that's certainly a part of this story as well. The perspective that I chose to take, and my focus in the paper that I wrote on this, is on the institutional decision to adopt and implement these solutions. In other words, I focus on universities and the decision-making process within universities. And I think that's important. I'm not saying the other approaches are not important too, but I think it's important to pay attention not just to the technology and to critique the technology, but to look at how these technologies are implemented. So this is a kind of AI governance perspective where you're looking at how the technology is put in place and operated and overseen. And to do that, I use a necessity and proportionality analysis. So what is remote proctoring? A 2020 EDUCAUSE survey identified 4 main categories of remote proctoring. One is passive monitoring of software used on students' computers. In other words, a tool downloaded onto the student's computer that just monitors what the student uses during the course of an exam. Are they using the web browser? Are they using other types of software applications? Another type is active restriction of software on students' computers, and you may be familiar with that. That's a kind of a lockdown browser tool where during the period of the exam, the student has to download a software. During the period of the exam, their computer is essentially locked down. It becomes a box for answering the exam, and has the student has access to nothing else on the computer and does not have access to the internet except for the purposes of transmitting their exam. There's also passive video surveillance of students, which can be direct recording by webcam, passive in the sense that the students are simply recorded. And active video surveillance is also possible, where you have live proctors remotely using video cameras to watch what the students are doing. this fourth category, I think, should be adapted to include AI-enabled proctoring, where the student is not simply being recorded, but is also being monitored in real time by artificial intelligence technologies. The other thing to note is that the categories can be mixed and matched. And so, for example, when respondents monitor the AI-enabled audio and video surveillance technology is used, it also requires use of Respondus lockdown browser. So you can have multiple tools operating at the same time. What AI-enabled proctoring does, because you can certainly have a situation, and some schools adopted these technologies, where you have a student being monitored by a proctor, and it can be one-on-one monitoring by a human proctor, who's usually in a call center in a developing country. But AI-enabled proctoring, with the idea of AI-enabled proctoring, of course, is the ability to do this much more quickly, to capture or flag many more behaviors, and to do it at a relatively low cost. What it does is it amplifies the intensity of the surveillance being experienced by the student, and it automates detection. It starts with identity verification, which is a form of facial recognition technology, although it's not the kind where an attempt is made to match an image of an individual with a collection of images in a database. Rather, the student has to hold up an identity document and show their face, and there's a matching process to make sure that the person in the identity document is the person who is sitting in front of the camera. These technologies can also use audio and video recordings to detect suspicious eye movements, suspicious physical movements, unusual keystrokes, because some of them incorporate keystroke monitoring, absences from in front of the computer, unusual noises in the background, other faces in the video, the presence of other humans in the room, the sound of other voices, and so on. And any suspicious incidents are flagged for review. Based on review, disciplinary processes can be triggered by the host institution, and the data is recorded and stored. As I mentioned, I chose to approach this using a necessity and proportionality framework. And I did this for a number of reasons. One is because, as I mentioned, I wanted to focus on the university. And so the question for the university, or the question for an institution adopting these kinds of technology, becomes, is it necessary? And is the implementation chosen one that's proportionate to the need? Right, so it's a way of asking whether this is an appropriate and proportionate adoption of technology to address a problem, and so it can be used as this kind of normative framework, certainly in the absence of any other AI governance framework, and we've been slow in Canada to come up with and develop any of these types of frameworks. It's also an approach developed in international human rights law and adapted as part of the analysis of human rights and privacy issues around the world. And I think it's particularly appropriate in this context because some of the most significant issues with AI-enabled proctoring are, of course, privacy and human rights issues. It provides a more holistic approach, and this is something that it's also been part of my experience as well, that the issues tend to get siloed otherwise, with either things being characterized as data protection issues or privacy issues or human rights issues, with separate legal mechanisms to respond to those. And I think it's important to think about all of those issues holistically as contributing to the analysis of whether adoption of this type of technology is necessary and proportionate. I also think that the public dimensions of universities support the use of this type of framework. Now, this is where, and I'm happy to have discussion on this afterwards or take questions on this, because this is part of this process where I've always stopped to question myself and wonder if I'm just too old-fashioned for this modern world. And this relates to my understanding or perception of the university. I think universities are pretty special places, right? I went to university when I was young. I went to university when I was not quite so young and getting a little bit older through the PhD. And then I started working in universities. I love universities. I believe in them. I believe that they have a particular place in society. I believe that universities have a particular social and moral responsibility, that they need to show leadership in ethics, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and that they should espouse and build upon the values of intellectual honesty and intellectual freedom. But some might say, get over yourself, lady. Universities are businesses now. They offer educational services, and they need to do it in an efficient and cost-effective way, and they need to do it in a way that meets the needs of their client base and so on. So, you know, but I do believe that they are still public institutions that espouse these values and should be held to this standard. So necessity and proportionality, the two broad questions in a necessity and proportionality approach are, first of all, is in this context, the adoption of some form of remote proctoring necessary? And the second is, are the measures chosen proportional to the demonstrated need? On the necessity side, the measure has to be necessary to achieve a sufficiently pressing and important objective, and all it has to be is reasonably necessary. It doesn't have to be essential. So there's no need for the adopting institution to show that they absolutely couldn't get by without remote proctoring in this case, just that it was a reasonably necessary measure in the circumstances. And necessity can also take into account exigent circumstances, such as the public health crisis that we experienced with COVID-19. And in fact, I'll note that there was Canadian public health guidance that was issued during the pandemic that suggested that remote proctoring could be a mitigation strategy adopted by universities seeking to implement social distancing. So this was flagged by Canadian public health authorities as a measure that universities might want to consider taking up, which might support a necessity argument. I mentioned to you as well the injunction, the attempt to get an injunction against the use of Proctorio, which is an AI-enabled tool by the University of Amsterdam, and that injunction was denied by a Dutch court, and that was early in the pandemic in May 2020, where the court found that essentially it was necessary for the university to do something and to do it quickly to address exam invigilation, which was coming up. And so, and that's why the injunction was not granted. And so, so certainly the pandemic circumstances, the exigent circumstances can support the necessity of a measure. Beyond that, a key justification for proctoring in general and remote proctoring in particular is the need to ensure academic integrity in student evaluations. And this was, you know, I found this was an interesting part of the research. I started to dig into the literature on cheating. Now, obviously, in terms of the university perspective, cheating can have an adverse reputational impact. If your university becomes known as a place where no attention is paid to academic integrity and students can cheat at will, it is going to adversely impact the reputation of the university. Academic integrity is also one of those core values of that special place that is the university, and it's something that we are supposed to value and protect. Evidence of this, of course, is that universities have regulations in place to address cheating, to require academic integrity, to define it, and to address cheating where it occurs. Beyond the university, cheating at university can have an adverse impact on society. Not only does it, if universities don't hold people to account, hold students to account, and hold a high standard, does that maybe contribute to a laxity in values? But you also, employers don't want to be hiring people who have cheated their way through university and who don't have the credentials that the papers say that they actually have. And for many students, cheating also devalues their achievements. For the students who don't cheat, they feel that their efforts are devalued by the fact that people around them may be cheating. So these are all arguments to support the necessity of this kind of exam surveillance. Research does demonstrate that cheating is a serious issue. And this really I found very interesting and quite discouraging as well. There's quite a bit of I've only cited a few things here. There's more cited in the paper, but there's quite a bit of research showing that the levels of cheating in higher education institutions are quite high. And so, for example, I reference here a study by Dyer and others that found that 62% of undergrad students surveyed admitted to cheating at least occasionally. Now, I note that a lot of this evidence is based on self-reporting. It's hard to get accurate data, and self-reporting is considered to be one of the best ways to get data, but of course it's also, there's a certain level of unreliability to it. I also found that a lot of the studies were looking at cheating in general and not focusing on cheating on exams versus cheating on assignments. And it was, so there were more global figures, and it may be that there's more cheating on assignments or papers than there is on exams, but in any event, there's still clearly a problem with cheating. There's also quite a lot of research now that shows that cheating is prevalent in online learning, particularly if no measures are in place to detect it. And that there's some evidence to support the idea that it is more prevalent online than for in-person courses. There are lots of theories advanced for why this might be the case, but that seems to be the way things are going. There are also now online subscription services to assist students in cheating on remote exams. There's evidence to show that the perception of the seriousness of cheating may be different from for online exams. Now, that research would have been conducted prior to the pandemic when most courses were in person, and it may be that those perceptions shift when university in general is online and exams are largely online. There are also studies that show that the lack of proctoring in an online context is seen as an invitation to collaborate. So all of this is evidence to suggest that universities need to do something. If they're going to be offering online exams, they need to have something in place to address the issue of student cheating, and they need to do that for a variety of reasons that impact the university, society generally, and students as well. So if there is a necessity, and if adoption of some form of online proctoring is necessary, how do you then approach the issue of proportionality? And so one of the ways is to ask whether the adopted measure is proportional to the demonstrated need. Has it been properly adapted to the circumstances, and does it minimally impair the rights at issue? I've mentioned before that urgency may factor into the necessity part of the test, but once the urgent circumstances are passed, there should also be a reassessment. So the fact that urgency can be used to justify the implementation of AI-enabled remote proctoring in in March or April 2020, when exams were looming and this all just happened all of a sudden, that's one thing. But once you're past that most urgent part and there's time to reflect and there's time to think about what you're doing, then there needs to be a reconsideration of the proportionality of the measures. So I'm just going to take a minute to talk a little bit about the cluster of rights that I think are impacted by remote proctoring, and in particular by AI-enabled remote proctoring. Data protection is one category of issues. And data protection laws set the rules and conditions for the collection and use of personal data. And it's certainly the case that there have been some remote proctoring data breaches. A couple that have been in the news affected ProctorU and ProctorTrack. There was a much publicized one involving Proctorio, which wasn't so much a data breach. The ProctorU, for example, was a hack. Proctorio was the CEO in a dispute with a student who had been complaining on social media about the service that she had received, the customer service she had received, and the CEO published chat logs with the student and later had to apologize for having done that. So it's a different sort of data breach. So those are some of the data protection issues, and I'll get into those in more detail in a minute. There are also privacy issues, and I separate the data protection issues from the privacy issues because I think it's important to do that. The data protection issues are about that collection, use, and disclosure of personal data. Privacy issues go to the dignity and autonomy of the individual. And I think in this context, it's really important to separate those two out and not just lump them all together as privacy. So remote proctoring options, particularly ones that use AI or human proctors, place students under constant and direct surveillance. And The AI-enabled systems in particular will flag head and eye movements or changes in typing speed and label those as possible cheating incidents. And as a result, they enhance anxiety at constant and detailed surveillance. So it's not just that you're under constant surveillance, but that as you're going along, the fact that you might stare at the ceiling or look off to the side when you're thinking might get flagged as a possible incident. And so that can be very anxiety producing. The AI-enabled software in particular does not deal well with the absence of a student from in front of the camera triggers a flag. So obviously taking a bathroom break will trigger a flag. And in some cases, bathroom breaks are either prohibited, advised against, or limited. And I looked at one option, for example, which did not allow students to take a bathroom break in the first hour of the exam. And, obviously, bodies do what bodies do. And so those kinds of formula may not be effective or appropriate for all students. The recordings also include students' private spaces, and many students expressed real concern and anxiety that it wasn't just them, they themselves that were under surveillance, but that their professors might have access to video of their private spaces as well, their professors or whoever is on the other end of the camera. There are also significant issues with respect to discrimination, and they can arise in a variety of different ways. Now, one of them relates to anxiety. There's quite a lot of data now that show that remote proctoring increases anxiety, increases student anxiety. There's also data that shows that student anxiety can worsen performance on exams. Now, many of you are probably listening and saying, well, people didn't need to do research to show that. Well, they do sort of have to do the research to show that, but I think that's something that people understand quite instinctively, that this can be an issue. And so this type of proctoring does cause anxiety and does enhance anxiety, and therefore may be problematic. Women may be more uncomfortable with live one-on-one proctoring, and this is certainly one option that sometimes this is you with somebody in a call center somewhere staring at you for 3 hours while you write an exam. You can imagine how uncomfortable that may be as an experience. There are also reports that some women have run into difficulties with requirements to remove head coverings at the identification stage. So that stage where you have to prove who you are by holding up ID and next to your face, women have been asked to remove head coverings. They have asked to be able to do that in front of women proctors. Sometimes that accommodation is met, but sometimes the women proctors are not available, and this can cause delays in being able to write the exam. Some students have disabilities or medical conditions that lead to movements or behaviors that may be flagged as suspicious by proctors or by AI-enabled monitoring. And the response to this has often been that, well, those students can request accommodation up front. They can basically document and disclose that they have these conditions. The response of those students has been, this condition does not impact my ability to write the exam. It just impacts my ability to be monitored by the software that you've chosen, right? So you're asking me to disclose medical information about myself and declare a disability, which is not an impediment to me performing in this course or writing this exam, but it just gets in the way of this particular technology, and they have objected to that. Students who need frequent bathroom breaks may run into difficulties. And one study noted that 26% of institutions use some products that don't meet their accessibility standards, and 8% did no accessibility vetting at all. There are also issues with racial discrimination. And so some Black students who have used AI-enabled remote proctoring have been required to change exam writing locations or lighting because face detection software couldn't function properly otherwise. So imagine you're already nervous about writing an exam, you sit down to start your exam and you're told, sorry, you have to find another room to write in, or you've got to change your lighting, or you've got to do something before you can start the exam. That's also obviously frustrating and anxiety producing. There's also evidence that affect recognition tools can incorporate racial bias. And now this isn't research specific to AI-enabled proctoring, but AI-enabled proctoring is being designed to read affect, to look at whether your expression has changed, your eyes are moving in certain ways or whatever. And so the research that is emerging on the racial biases and affect recognition tools may be relevant here as well. There may also be issues with the human in the loop who determines which flagged incidents are significant. And this I find really very interesting and hugely problematic in terms of the implementation. And so maybe I'll talk a little bit about it here because it's very complicated, right? So AI-enabled software, remote proctoring software, will flag incidents that it considers suspicious. So the student writes the exam and there'll be flags when they stare at the ceiling, when they do different things, and these flags are recorded. And at the end of the exam, the instructor receives a report with all of the flags for all of the exams, and the instructor has access to the video. Now, note I say here the instructor, it doesn't have to be an instructor, but that's kind of the default of these systems. So the instructor has all of these flags. With that, there are a number of different things that can happen. One of them is that the instructor can say, the university in this pandemic has already imposed on me to switch my course from in-person learning to online learning, to develop all these online tools, to develop the online exam. And now they want me to watch a whole bunch of videos. I'm sorry, but I don't have time. And I'm not going to watch them at all, which means that the students just went through that anxiety producing event and nobody's going to look at the flags and nothing will happen. Or maybe the professor decides, I'm going to save time and I'm going to look at the ones who trigger the most flags, right? And I'll ignore the other ones. Or maybe they pass it off to a TA or an RA who will then look at all of these videos of these students in their private spaces, which can raise its own sets of issues. Or the instructor looks at the flags, but then makes their own interpretation about whether to report something as cheating. And this is where it can get really, you know, if you think about it, if you've got software that's already flagged these students and you've got a professor looking at them, who's to say, we're all human, right? That a professor's not going to look at it and say, oh, no, that's a really good student. They were great. They showed up for everything. You know, I'm not worried about these flags. They can't be serious. But this student didn't come to class an awful lot. And look at how many times they've been flagged. And maybe, you know, maybe it is cheating. And this is the way in which the instructor's biases may inform how those flags are dealt with. So the human in the loop here becomes an interesting problem. In a sense, the human in the loop is meant to be a safeguard, but the human in the loop, in this instance, the default is the professor. And there are lots of problems with that being the default. And I've just outlined some of those problems. And so, you know, is that really right? Now, one of the proctoring companies has recently announced that it was no longer sending any flags back to the university without providing their own human in the loop first, because they found that, I think the statistic was only 11% of flagged incidents were reviewed by professors, which is pretty low, right? Only 11% of the flagged incidents were actually reviewed, and they felt that that just undermined the integrity of the whole thing. And so they decided that they would provide their own humans in the loop. So anyway, something to, in terms of implementation, something to think about in terms of both discrimination and privacy and some of the other issues it raises. The other thing to note is that students with low socioeconomic status or who live in rural or remote locations, who face constraints such as close quarter living spaces or childcare obligations may also run into difficulties with remote proctoring, because all of those circumstances can raise flags with remote proctoring services if there's noise from other people in the household and so on. And so, you know, and these are issues for online learning in general, but they also come up with remote proctoring. So, so then, of course, if you start to think about minimally impairing implementations, you know, there are different options available for universities, mandatory versus optional proctoring with realistic alternatives, as opposed to alternatives that aren't particularly practical or easy for students. Elimination of elements that are most problematic or unacceptable. So deciding that, you know, something that maybe AI enabled is simply too much and some other form is going to be adopted. Consideration of alternative strategies. And this is where many professors already changed their modes of evaluation to avoid the exam. And I also put on here transparency and consultation as part of a minimally impairing implementation. A lot of this stuff happened without any involvement or participation by faculty or by students in terms of the choices that were adopted and the approaches that were adopted. And so a greater transparency in consultation could be a value that can help in choosing a minimally impairing implementation of some form of remote proctoring. For proportionality, when it comes to data protection, there are a range of issues, and I want to save some time for questions, so I'm not going to get into a lot of detail with this. There are options such as campus-wide subscription versus student-paid services. And of course, with student-paid services, the student has to provide their payment information and other personal information directly to the company. It's important to think about what data is being collected, how they're being stored, how they're being accessed, and by whom. And there are lots of choices that can be made at these different stages. So these are places where it's possible to make choices about the collection and storage of data and the review of data that can lead to a minimally impairing implementation. As far as discrimination and privacy are concerned, again, there are a range of different choices that can be made about identifying and addressing the risks and impact of discrimination, making accommodations that are practical and reasonable accommodations, and addressing the anxiety issues, which I think is quite significant. There are also interesting questions that come up in the context of the particular technologies. Many of them allow surveillance parameters to be set for exams. And so they actually pass on a considerable amount of discretion to professors to choose what degree of surveillance is going to be in place. I've mentioned the issue of who addresses or reviews flagged incidents. And I think this is a really important issue. Who should review those flags and in what context? Another issue for universities to think about is a flag presumptive cheating that has to be rebutted by the student? Like, at what point does the student get called to account for any flags that have occurred during their evaluation? Another thing, and this will be familiar to anyone who works in the AI governance area, is whether there's a procedure in place for the university to collect and audit data, including flagged incidents, those sent for discipline, those dismissed, and disciplinary outcomes. In other words, to measure the performance of the system. If you're going to implement a system like this, what kind of data will be collected on an ongoing basis by the institution to ensure that it's working fairly and appropriately? And so are you going to be gathering data that will allow you to see that, for example, more racialized students are being flagged and sent to disciplinary proceedings than white students, for example, or proportionally more? What kind of data is going to be collected to assess the outcomes and see if those outcomes are fair and proportionate? And then, of course, what level of transparency is in place regarding the operation of remote and AI-enabled surveillance? How much do students really know about how these technologies work, what's being recorded, and so on? There are alternatives. Obviously, I've mentioned that professors changed their modes of evaluation during the pandemic. Some universities have shifted to using gallery view Zoom proctored by humans to replicate that sort of one proctor in front of a classroom of 30 or 60 faces, right? As opposed to one-on-one surveillance. Some universities have ended the use of AI-enabled proctoring. In other words, after the urgent situation, the immediate urgency had passed, they went back and assessed these tools and concluded that AI-enabled proctoring was not appropriate. So UC Berkeley has banned entirely the use of third-party proctoring services, and York University has ended the use of remote proctoring unless there are exceptional circumstances. And so I'm going to finish off. As I said, I want to save time for questions and discussion. So I'll just finish off with flagging a few questions for you, and you may have others, but if you want to jump in on these, that's fine as well. And so one of them is that question that I mentioned bothers me through all of this, which is the extent to which the university context factors into the necessity and proportionality analysis. In other words, would the calculation be different for something like a bar exam or other professional certification? Is it more justifiable to use AI-enabled remote proctoring in those contexts than in the university context? And if so, why? Something I think to think about in terms of what we're trying to do. Another question is whether the risks to privacy, data protection, and human rights are simply too high for AI-enabled proctoring. Is this a tool that we should be using at all? And if so, what measures would have to be in place to make it acceptable? And then a final question is whether the goal of university proctoring is to deter cheating or to stamp it out. And I think it goes back to my, my question about the university and what the role of the university is. Is part of our educative role to encourage students to value academic integrity and to strive for academic integrity, providing deterrent to cheating along the way, or is it to impose and enforce academic integrity? Absolutely. And I think there is, I think there's a legitimate question there to be asked. So I will stop there. Thank you very much for your attention and your participation on another, yet another Zoom interaction. Much appreciated. And I will stop sharing my slides so that we can have a conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Zalagi, for proctoring, a word I may or may not have chosen deliberately, that Q&A, and Professor Scassa for your very interesting insights and frank responses. This really is a fantastic way that hits close to home in a university to finish up our Distinguished Visitors Lecture Series for the year. So on behalf of the Robson Hall community, I can only convey our deepest sense of gratitude. Thank you very much. And we hope one day we can let you back and host you in person.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure to be here. And thank you to everybody for their great engagement. I really appreciated that.